The eviction notice was taped to the apartment door at exactly the height of her daughter's eyes, and that was the detail Mara Quinlan could not forgive. Not the notice itself. She had known it was coming the way a person knows a storm is coming, by the pressure in the air, by the way Mr. Petrakis had stopped meeting her eyes in the stairwell. But whoever had taped it up had put it low, right where a 7-year-old coming home from school would see it first, and Bertie had seen it first, and Bertie had stood in the hallway of the Delmore Street building with her backpack still on both shoulders and asked in a small voice whether they were going to live in the car again. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. They had never lived in the car. They had come close once, 2 winters ago, close enough that Mara had cleared out the trunk and folded the back seats down one night just to see how the 3 of them might fit. But Bertie had been asleep when she did it, and Theo had promised he would never tell, and Theo, who was 12 and kept promises the way other boys kept baseball cards, never had. Which meant Bertie had figured it out on her own. Which meant her 7-year-old had been lying awake doing the same arithmetic Mara did every night. And that was the thing about being poor that nobody ever put in the pamphlets. It was not the hunger. They were never quite hungry. It was watching your children learn to do the math. Mara peeled the notice off the door before Theo got home, folded it into quarters, and put it in her coat pocket, where it sat all through dinner like a stone. Macaroni again, with a can of peas stirred in and the last of the shredded cheese from the bag she had been rationing since Sunday. Theo ate 2 helpings and said it was good. Theo always said it was good. Bertie arranged her peas into a circle and asked if they could get a dog when things calmed down, and Mara said maybe, honey, and hated herself for it, because maybe was the word she used when the answer was no, and she was too tired to watch a face fall. She was 39 years old. She worked mornings at Sunrise Commercial Laundry out on Route 9, feeding hotel sheets into a pressing machine the size of a small car, 8 hours in wet heat that smelled like bleach and scorched cotton. And 3 nights a week, she cleaned the offices above the savings bank downtown, emptying wastebaskets for men whose wastebaskets were worth more than her car. The car was a 2008 Pontiac with 211,000 miles on it, and a transmission that shifted like it was thinking it over. Her husband Danny had been dead 3 years. An aneurysm. At the kitchen table, on a Tuesday morning in March, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and the crossword half done. He was 38 years old. He had been a drywall finisher, a union man for 6 years, and then a cash man after the union work dried up, and the cash work came with no insurance, and the ambulance, and the emergency room, and the 4 days of machines that everyone already knew were not going to bring him back had come to $61,000, and the hospital had been very understanding, and the collection agency the hospital sold the debt to had not. So Mara pressed sheets. She emptied wastebaskets. She was $1,850 behind on rent for a 2-bedroom apartment on Delmore Street in Harlow Falls, Ohio, a town on the Ashwick River that had once made ball bearings for half the country and now mostly made excuses. And on the 9th of September, a Tuesday, 11 days after the notice went up on the door, a letter came that changed everything, though it did not look like that kind of letter. It looked like a bill. Heavy cream paper, a return address embossed in the corner. Mott and Weiss, attorneys at law, for 12 Canal Street, Harlow Falls. Mara stood at the mailboxes in the lobby of her building and almost did not open it, because in her experience envelopes from lawyers contained exactly one kind of news, and she had had enough of that kind. She opened it in the stairwell, sitting on the 4th step, because her knees had learned to expect the worst sitting down. Dear Miss Quinlan, the letter said, we regret to inform you of the death of Mr. Aldous Finch of this city, on August the 22nd, at the age of 87. Our office represents the estate. You are named in Mr. Finch's will as his sole heir. The principal asset of the estate is the property at 100 Canal Street, commonly known as the Ambrose Arms. We ask that you contact this office at your earliest convenience, as there are time-sensitive matters concerning the property that require your immediate attention. It was signed Gerald R. Mott. Mara read it twice on the 4th step, and a 3rd time standing up. Aldous Finch. She knew the name the way a person knows a word in a language they stopped speaking as a child. Her grandmother had been Ada Finch before she married. Ada Finch of Harlow Falls, a switchboard operator, a maker of terrible fruitcakes, A woman who died when Mara was 14 and left behind 3 photo albums and a silence. Aldous was Ada's younger brother. Mara had met him once that she could remember, at her grandmother's funeral 25 years ago. A tall, stooped man near the back of the funeral home who had not come to the reception after, who had shaken her hand with a grip like a bird's foot and looked at her face for a long, uncomfortable moment and said, "You have Ada's eyes," and then had put on his hat and gone out into the rain. Her mother, when Mara had asked about him later, had waved a hand and said, "Oh, Aldous. Nobody sees Aldous. Aldous lives in that building," and the way she said that building had closed the subject the way a door closes. That building. The Ambrose Arms. Everybody in Harlow Falls knew the Ambrose Arms the way everybody in a family knows the relative nobody talks about. 6 stories of dark brick and carved limestone at the corner of Canal and First, a residential hotel put up in 1926 back when the town had money and the money wanted somewhere grand to sleep. It had a name cut into stone above the doors and a copper cornice gone green as old pennies and windows boarded with plywood that had itself gone gray with years. The city had condemned it in 2019 after a pipe burst on the 4th floor and brought down half a ceiling. It had stood empty since, or nearly empty, because everyone knew old Finch still lived in there somehow. The caretaker, the holdout, the ghost of the place, shuffling out for groceries on Tuesday mornings and speaking to no one. Kids threw rocks at the 3rd floor windows and told each other the building was haunted. The Harlow Falls Courier ran an editorial every year or so calling it an eyesore and a hazard and a monument to everything the town needed to tear down and put behind it. And now, according to a sheet of cream paper in her coat pocket, it belonged to her. Mara did not tell the children that night. She made dinner, checked Theo's math homework, sat with Bertie through a chapter of a library book about a mouse who sails a boat, and lay awake until 2 in the morning listening to the radiator tick and doing a new kind of arithmetic she did not have numbers for. She called Mott and Weiss from the laundry break room at 10:15 the next morning, standing between a humming soda machine and a bulletin board of safety posters, with her hand cupped around the phone. Gerald Mott turned out to be a soft-voiced man, near 70, who asked her to come in that afternoon if she possibly could. "There are deadlines, Miss Quinlan," he said, and there was something in the way he said deadlines that made the hair on her arms stand up. She traded the rest of her shift to Charlene, who took it with a raised eyebrow and a comment about some people winning the lottery, and she drove the Pontiac downtown through a gray drizzle and parked across from 412 Canal. And before she went in, she sat behind the wheel for a minute and looked down the block at the thing she had apparently inherited. The Ambrose Arms took up most of its corner. Even boarded, even filthy, even with a sapling growing sideways out of a 6th-floor window box like a flag of surrender, it had bones that made the newer buildings around it look temporary. Somebody had carved oak leaves into the limestone over the entrance, and above the oak leaves, in letters a foot tall, the name Ambrose, and the drizzle ran down the carved letters and dripped off the E the way it had presumably been doing for 100 years. Stapled to the plywood over the front doors, sun-faded and rain-wrinkled, was a large orange notice. Mara could read only the biggest line from across the street. Notice of demolition. Something turned over in her stomach, slow and cold. She fed the meter and went in to see the lawyer. The offices of Mott and Weiss occupied the 2nd floor of a narrow building that smelled of paper and radiator dust, and Gerald Mott met her at the top of the stairs himself. A small man in a cardigan the color of oatmeal, with reading glasses pushed up into white hair, and the careful manner of someone who has spent 50 years delivering news to people sitting in the same worn leather chair he now offered her. He gave her coffee she did not ask for. He arranged 3 folders on the desk between them and squared their edges with 2 fingers, and then he folded his hands and looked at her over the tops of his glasses and said, "Miss Quinlan, how much do you know about your great-uncle?" "Almost nothing," Mara said. "I met him once. At my grandmother's funeral." Mott nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "Aldous was my client for 41 years, he said. "I will tell you what I can, and I will tell you now that there are things about Aldous I never understood myself, and I knew him better than anyone living, which is to say hardly at all." He opened the first folder. "Here is what the paper says. Your great-uncle was the owner of record of the Ambrose Arms. He acquired the building in 1973 from the estate of the previous owner for a sum that was, frankly, nominal. Before that, he had been the superintendent of the building since 1958, and before that a porter and a boiler man. And he first went to work there in 1952, at the age of 14, running messages. He worked in that building or owned that building for 73 years, Miss Quinlan. He lived in it for 60 of them. He never married. He kept the taxes current every January in cash, even after the condemnation, even when the taxes on a condemned building were money thrown down a well. His account at First Merchants holds $2,106, which after the costs of his burial leaves the estate approximately $400 in cash. And it leaves the building. He slid the second folder across the desk. And here, he said, is the part that will not wait. The city of Harlow Falls condemned the Ambrose Arms 6 years ago. In March of this year, the city council approved a redevelopment plan for the 3 blocks between Canal Street and the river. The plan is being carried by a private partner, the Prather Group, and I imagine you have seen the drawings in the Courier, riverfront apartments, a marina, a hotel with a glass front. The Ambrose Arms sits in the middle of it like a tooth they cannot pull. While your uncle lived, they could not touch it. There are protections for an owner and residents, and Aldous knew every one of them, and he used every one of them, and I know because I filed the papers. Aldous died on the 22nd of August. On the 29th, 1 week later, the city recorded an emergency demolition order, citing structural hazard. Mott took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I have practiced law in this town since Lyndon Johnson was president, he said, and I have never seen an order move through that office in a week. Demolition is scheduled for the 23rd of September. That is 14 days from today. It is a Tuesday. Mara sat very still with the coffee cooling in her hands. And I own it, she said. You own it, Mott said. Or you will when probate concludes, and Aldous structured everything years ago so that probate would conclude fast. You also own, I am obliged to say, everything that comes with it. The liability if a wall falls on someone. The fines the city has been writing since the 29th at $300 a day. And this. He slid the third folder across. Inside was a single letter on heavy paper from a firm in Columbus representing the Prather Group, and Mara read it twice. The Prather Group was offering to take the property off the estate's hands, as is, where is, together with all associated liabilities and accrued municipal fines, for the sum of $40,000, provided the transfer was executed before the demolition date. The letter used the phrase generous accommodation twice and the phrase for the avoidance of doubt once, and something about it made Mara think of a hand patting a dog it did not like. $40,000. She heard the number in her own kitchen, at 2 in the morning, in the voice that did the arithmetic. $40,000 was the rent caught up and the collection agency gone, and the transmission fixed and first and last on a better apartment, and shoes that fit, and $800 left over for the first Christmas in 3 years that would not be an apology. $40,000 was oxygen. Mr. Mott, she said, why would they pay $40,000 for a building they are tearing down in 2 weeks anyway? Mott put his glasses back on. That, he said, is a very good question, and I will give you the honest answer, which is that I do not know. If you do nothing, the city demolishes on the 23rd and bills the estate for the cost, and the estate is insolvent, and the lot goes to tax sale, and Prather buys it there for less than 40. They know that. Their lawyers certainly know that. And yet they want your signature, and they want it before Tuesday the 23rd, and they are willing to pay real money for the difference between having it and not having it. In my experience, Miss Quinlan, when a man offers you $40,000 for a thing he insists is worthless, the thing is one of 2 kinds. Either it is dangerous to him somehow, or it is not worthless. He folded his hands again. There is one more matter, he said, and I confess it is the reason I asked you to come today instead of Friday. Aldous left instructions. Not in the will. The will is 1 page. These he left with me in a sealed envelope 11 years ago, with directions that they be given to his heir in person, in private, before any disposition of the property. His words, before any disposition. He opened the desk drawer and took out an envelope, ordinary white, gone slightly yellow, sealed with tape that had been sealed and resealed at least once, and across the front, in a careful old-fashioned hand, 3 lines. For the one who comes after me. Read it inside the building. Nowhere else. Mara turned the envelope over in her hands. It weighed nothing. It felt like it weighed a great deal. He was specific about that, Mott said. Inside the building. He made me repeat it back to him. I asked him why, and he looked at me the way he looked at everyone who asked him anything, which was politely and like a wall. She looked up. Mr. Mott, did you ever ask him why he stayed? All those years, in a condemned building, with the city finding him and the pipes gone and the whole town calling the place a hazard. He could have sold. You said Prather made offers while he was alive. 3, Mott said. The last one, 2 years ago, was for $650,000. Mara's mouth went dry. He turned down $650,000, she said, and he had $2,000 in the bank. He turned it down by return mail, Mott said. I drafted the letter. One sentence. Mr. Finch declines. And once, only once, after the second offer, when I pressed him, because it is my job to press, he said something I have thought about ever since. He said, Gerald, I am not the owner of that building. I am the watchman, and a watchman does not sell the gate. Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain, and it ran down the tall window of the office in ropes, and somewhere below a bus hissed past on Canal Street. Mara sat in the worn leather chair with an envelope in her hands and a decision in her lap that had a Tuesday attached to it, and she asked the question she had been circling since the stairwell on Delmore Street. What would you do, she said. Gerald, Mott was quiet for a moment. I am your lawyer as of this morning if you want me, he said, and a lawyer would tell you that $40,000 is real and the building is condemned and the city holds every card, and that liability does not care how a story feels. That is what a lawyer would tell you. He took a breath. But you did not ask the lawyer. You asked the old man who filed Aldous Finch's papers for 41 years and watched him guard that building like it held the crown jewels. And the old man would tell you this. Do not sign anything until you have stood inside it and read what he left you. You have 14 days. Use one of them. She used it the next day, which was a Thursday, and she brought the children, because there was no one to leave them with, and because, though she did not examine the feeling closely, she did not want to go in alone. But first came Wednesday night, and Wednesday night came with Denise. Denise was Danny's older sister, a loan officer at First Merchants with a good house on the hillside of town and a firm belief, held with the sincerity of a religion, that everything wrong in Mara's life could be traced to Mara's decisions. She came by twice a month with groceries Mara had not asked for and opinions Mara had not asked for either, and the groceries were always welcome and always cost more than they cost. She arrived at 7 with 2 bags from the Kroger and the news already in her mouth, because Harlow Falls was a town of 31,000 people, and a lawyer's secretary has a sister, and a sister has a phone. So, she said, setting the bags on the counter and not taking off her coat. You inherited the Finch building. Mara said that she had, more or less, pending probate. Denise laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, exactly. It was worse. It was the laugh of a person being patient. Oh, honey, she said. The Ambrose Arms. You know what that is, right? That is not an inheritance. That is a lawsuit with a roof. Half a roof. Kenny at the bank says the city's been trying to knock that thing down for 6 years, and the old man was the only reason they couldn't. And now, and I am saying this with love, now the only thing standing between that wreck and a wrecking ball is you, which is the first lucky thing that has happened to you in years, because it means it is not your problem, it is their problem. And all you have to do is sign whatever they put in front of you and cash whatever they staple to it. Theo had come to the kitchen doorway and was standing there with his math book under his arm, listening the way 12-year-olds listen, which is completely, while appearing to read a cereal box. There's an offer, Mara said. 40,000. Denise put both hands flat on the counter, and for a second her face was pure honest hunger on Mara's behalf, and that second was the truest thing that passed between them all night. $40,000, she said. Mara Quinlan. $40,000, and you are standing in this kitchen instead of signing it? What is there to think about? Sign it tomorrow. Sign it tonight if the man has a fax machine. Do you know what people are saying already? Rhonda at the branch heard it from her husband who plays golf with Dale Prather's project man, and they are laughing about it. Han, the pressing machine girl who inherited the haunted hotel. Do not be the punchline. Take the money. And the thing was, Denise was not wrong. That was what Mara thought later, lying awake at 1 and then 2 with the radiator ticking. Everything Denise said was true. The building was condemned. The city held every card. $40,000 was oxygen, and people who cannot breathe do not get to be romantic about air. The only thing on the other side of the scale was an envelope she was not allowed to open in her own kitchen, and a dead man she had met once, and a sentence a lawyer had carried around for years. A watchman does not sell the gate. At 2:15 she got up and stood at the window over Delmore Street, where the streetlight made the rain look like static, and she asked herself the only question that had ever gotten her anywhere, which was not what do I want, and not what is fair, but what will I be able to explain to my children in 10 years? And she found she could imagine explaining the $40,000. Rent, debts, shoes, Christmas. Any mother could explain that, and no child would ever forgive it less than instantly. What she could not imagine explaining was the other thing, the thing with no number on it, the sentence she would have to say out loud someday. There was a letter, and I was 14 days from finding out, and I did not go look. So on Thursday morning she called the laundry and coughed twice and said she was sick, which cost her $68 she did not have, and she kept the children home from school, which cost her a conversation with the attendance office she would pay later, and she told them the truth, or a shape of it. We inherited a building from your great-great-uncle, she said over oatmeal. It is old, and it is a mess, and we are going to go look at it before the city tears it down. Theo put down his spoon. We own a building, he said carefully, like a boy checking his footing on ice. A big one. 6 floors, Mara said. Bertie asked if it had an elevator. It did, Mara said, but it had not run in 30 years, so they would be taking the stairs, and everyone would be holding hands. And nobody, she looked at Theo, nobody was to touch anything, lean on anything, or go through any door first. Gerald Mott met them at the corner of Canal and First at 10 with a ring of keys that must have weighed 3 pounds and an aluminum flashlight for each of them, including a small one for Bertie, which he presented to her with a gravity that won her completely. The rain had stopped overnight, and the morning was one of those washed September mornings where the light comes in low and gold, and even a dying downtown looks like it is remembering something. Up close, the Ambrose Arms was bigger than it had any right to be. The plywood over the doors had been screwed down by the city, but Aldous, Mott explained, had never used the front doors anyway, and he led them down the side of the building along First Street, past window after boarded window, to a steel service door in an alcove near the loading dock, painted the same brown as the brick so that you would walk past it your whole life and never see it. 3 locks, top, middle, bottom, and Mott worked through them in an order he had clearly been taught, and the door opened inward without a sound, on hinges that someone had oiled, recently and faithfully, for years. They stepped into the dark, and the dark smelled wrong. That was the first thing Mara noticed, and it took her a moment to understand, because what it smelled like was wrong for what the building was supposed to be. She had braced for rot, mildew, pigeons, the wet, dead smell of a ruin. Instead, the air in the service corridor was dry and cool and smelled of floor wax and machine oil and, faintly, of pipe tobacco. The smell of a building that was being kept. Their flashlights found a corridor with a clean-swept floor. Found brass fittings on the standpipes, polished. Found, on a shelf by the door, a kerosene lantern, filled, its chimney glass spotless, and a box of wooden matches, and a clipboard hanging on a nail. Mott lifted the clipboard and held his light on it, and was quiet for so long that Mara came to look. It was a maintenance log, columns ruled by hand. Date, task, initials. Boiler room some checked. Roof drains cleared, northeast. 4th floor ceiling shored, joist sistered. Traps filled, floors 2 through 6. Down the right-hand column, hundreds of times, thousands of times, the same 2 letters. AF. The last entry was dated the 20th of August. 2 days before he died, Mott said softly. He was 87 years old. The city engineer's report says this structure is an imminent hazard. He set the clipboard back on its nail with something close to reverence. Miss Quinlan, I have seen that report. It has photographs. Broken windows, the water damage on 4, the back stair. I assumed the rest. Everyone assumed the rest. He turned his light down the long, clean corridor. Nobody has been past this door in 30 years except Aldous. They walked the ground floor first. The lobby, when they came into it through the service passage, made Bertie gasp out loud, and the gasp went up and up because the ceiling was 2 stories over their heads, coffered in dark wood, and their 3 flashlight beams crossing in the dark found things one at a time the way you find constellations. A chandelier sheathed in a muslin bag, hanging like a wasp nest the size of a piano. A front desk of carved walnut, 40 feet of it, under dust sheets that had themselves been changed, because the sheets were clean. A floor of small hexagonal tiles, white and black, laid out in a border of oak leaves, and where the light raked at Mara could see the path, a track worn faintly lighter through the dust film. One man's footsteps back and forth across 60 years, from the service door to the desk to the brass wall of mailboxes and back. Behind the desk, the mailboxes rose in ranks, hundreds of little brass doors with white porcelain numbers, and every door hung open and empty except one. 607. 607 was closed. Theo saw it first, because Theo was the kind of boy who noticed the one thing turned the wrong way in any room, and he stood pointing his flashlight at it, and said, "Mom, why is that one shut?" Mara looked at Mott. Mott looked at the little brass door, and then at the ring of keys in his hand, and said 607 was his apartment. 6th floor, southeast corner. He lived in that unit from 1965. When the city condemned the building, he was legally obliged to vacate the residential floors, and he satisfied the letter of that by moving a cot down into the manager's office behind this desk. But he went up every day. It is in the log. 607, checked. 607, checked. 6,000 entries, if there is one. He worked a small brass key off the ring, a key with a paper tag gone soft as cloth from handling, and on the tag, in the same careful hand as the envelope, 607. "I believe," he said, "that this is where you are meant to read your letter." The stairs took 20 minutes, because Mott was 70 years old and Bertie's legs were 7, and because the staircase itself kept stopping them. It was a grand stair for the first 2 floors, marble treads and a bronze rail, and then a plainer stair after that. And at every landing Aldous had left the building's history standing in the dark like furniture in a closed room. On the 2nd floor landing, a wall of framed photographs, and Mott's flashlight went across them slowly. The Ambrose Arms in 1926, brand new, with awnings striped like candy and a doorman out front and men in straw hats crossing Canal Street. The lobby full of people in evening clothes, New Year's of 29, a banner with the year on it. A man in all of them, or most of them, silver-haired, straight-backed, with a watch chain and a face that managed to look both generous and careful at once. "That is Sylvan Ambrose," Mott said. "He built it. Owned the Pearl Button Works and half the block besides. They called him the Duke of Canal Street, and from what Aldous told me, he was that rare thing. A rich man the poor half of town actually mourned. He carried families through 30 and 31 and 32. There are people in this town today who exist because their grandparents ate on Sylvan Ambrose's tab through the worst of it." On the 3rd floor landing there was a photograph that stopped Mara cold. A young woman at a switchboard, sleeves rolled, hair pinned, laughing at something outside the frame, and the little brass plate under the frame said, "A. Finch, hotel operator, 1949. "Grandma," Mara said, and her voice came out strange. Theo and Bertie crowded in under her arms, and the 4 of them stood looking at Ada Finch, 19 years old, laughing in a building her granddaughter now owned. And Bertie said, "She looks like you, Mom," and Mara found she had to look at the stairs for a moment before she could climb them. "Your grandmother worked the board here for 6 years, Mott said as they went up. "It is how Aldous came to the building at all. She got him the messenger job when he was 14 and their father was gone and there was nothing at home. Aldous told me once that the Ambrose Arms fed his family before it employed him. I did not understand what he meant. I think he meant Sylvan." The 6th floor corridor ran the length of the building, doors standing open all down its length, apartments stripped and broom clean, and at the far end, at the southeast corner, one door was shut, and on it, in porcelain numbers, 607. The key turned like the lock had been oiled that morning. It probably had been oiled that month. The door swung in, and daylight came out. The windows of 607 were not boarded. They were the only unboarded windows in the building above the ground floor, and Mara would learn later that from the street they did not read as unboarded, because Aldous had fitted gray-painted shutters inside the glass that he opened only by day, so that for 30 years the building had kept one eye open and the whole town had walked past beneath it, never looking up. The morning sun came through the tall southeast glass and lay across a room from another century. A brass bed, made, with hospital corners. A shaving stand. A rag rug. A wall of shelves built by hand. and on the shelves, hundreds of books and dozens of black-bound notebooks, numbered on their spines in white ink. A tin coffee pot on a hot plate. A worn armchair by the window with a standing lamp and a footstool, and on the footstool, folded, a lap blanket, as though the man who folded it expected to be back by evening. On the small table beside the armchair sat a framed photograph of Ada at the switchboard, the twin of the one on the third-floor landing, and next to it a candy dish holding butterscotch in gold cellophane. And Bertie looked at the dish and then up at her mother, and Mara nodded. And Bertie took one and put it in her pocket and did not eat it, and never did eat it. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. And years later, Mara would find it in a small box of things her daughter kept, still in its gold wrapper, and would have to leave the room. She read the letter standing at the window, in the sun, because that felt right, with Mott sitting in the armchair with his eyes closed like a man in church, and the children turning slowly in the middle of the rug the way children turn in museums. The envelope tape lifted easily. Inside were 4 pages in the careful hand, dated 11 years earlier, and a second, smaller envelope, sealed, with one word on it. After Mara, the letter began, and her own name in a dead man's writing went through her like cold water. Mara, I have your name from the funeral book, and I have kept up with you at a distance, which was wrong of me, and not doing more for you was wrong of me too, and I will be plain about why I did not. Everything I might have given you would have drawn eyes toward you, and the eyes this building draws are not kind, and I judged that you were safer poor than noticed. You may hate me for that arithmetic. I made it looking at your children through a fence at the school picnic like some old crow, and I made it with love, for whatever an old crow's love is worth. If Gerald has done as I asked, you are reading this inside the arms, and so you have seen that the wreck they describe in the newspaper does not exist above the ground floor, and you are beginning to understand that a great deal of trouble has been taken here, over a great many years, to make a sound building look like a dying one. I took that trouble. My whole life went into taking it. Now I must tell you why, and I must do it carefully, because I do not know whose hands will hold this page. When I was 16 years old, Sylvan Ambrose was dying on the 4th floor of this building, and your grandmother and I were among the very few he would allow in the room. On the last night, he sent even the nurse away, and he kept me, a boilerman's apprentice, a nobody, because a nobody was exactly what he needed, and he told me what he had done in March of 1933, and what was under this building, and what it had cost him, and who had come looking for it in the years after, wearing good suits and bad intentions, and why they must never find it. I gave him my word. I was 16. I did not understand what a word weighs. I have spent 71 years finding out, and I will tell you, it weighs about 6 stories. I am not going to write in this letter what it is, or where it is. Forgive me. Paper travels, and I have twice in my life had reason to know that this room has been entered while I was out of it. Once in 1962 and once in 1991, by someone with skill and patience, who took nothing, because there was nothing findable to take, and who left believing, I trust, that the old stories were only stories. What I will write is this. The stories are not only stories. Sylvan Ambrose was cash rich in the winter of '32 when every bank in this county was folding, and he did not fold with them. And in the spring of '33 the government called in what the government called in, and Sylvan, who had watched the banks eat his neighbors alive, made a decision a more obedient man would not have made. He converted, and he concealed, and he meant it for this town. That is the part they never guessed, the ones who came looking. They thought it was a miser's hole. It was a lifeboat. He told me, "Boy, the day is coming when this town will be on its knees again, and when that day comes, this building will remember what it is for." Then he told me where, and he told me the words to say to whoever I passed it to, and he died at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning with your grandmother holding one hand and me holding the other. Here is what I ask, and it is a great deal, and you are free to refuse it. Do not sell. Do not sign. Do not believe the city's engineer, who has never been past the service door. Above all, watch the man who comes smiling with money, because his grandfather came in 1946 with the same smile, and his father came in 1977, and the family has been circling this block for 80 years, and they do not want the land. Riverfront apartments do not need your corner and never did. Ask yourself why the drawings in the newspaper keep this footprint, why the demolition order names a private salvage contractor, why the contract specifies that the debris of the Ambrose Arms goes to their yard and no other. Nobody pays to keep broken brick, Mara. They are not buying a building. They are buying the right to sift it. In the notebooks on the third shelf you will find what I could prove. In the smaller envelope, you will find what to do on the day you find the rest. Do not open it until that day. You will know the day, because on that day you will be standing where I stood when I was 16, and you will understand that the floor you are standing on is not a floor. Your grandmother knew. She kept it to her grave, and it cost her, and she never once complained, and you have her eyes, and I am sorry, and I am not sorry, and the butterscotch is for the little one. Aldous. Mara stood in the sun with the 4 pages shaking very slightly in her hands, and read the last paragraph again, and then once more, and the sentence rose off the page and filled the room. The floor you are standing on is not a floor. She looked down. The floor of 607 was oak parquet, honey-colored, laid in a herringbone, worn satin smooth along the path from door to armchair to bed, and it looked like every other floor in the building, and Aldous had walked across it every single day for 60 years, checking, the logs said, checking, and Theo, who had been watching her face while she read the way he had watched her face over the macaroni, said, "Mom, what does it say?" Later, she almost said, because later was the mother word, the maybe word, the word for closed doors. She looked at her son, who did the math at night, and her daughter, who saved the butterscotch, and Gerald Mott, who had carried a sealed envelope for 11 years without steaming it open, which she now understood was its own kind of oath, and she made the first decision of her new life, which was that this family was done being managed. "It says," she said, "that your Uncle Aldous kept a promise for 71 years, and that this building is not what the town thinks it is, and that somewhere in it there is something a rich man's family has wanted for 3 generations, and that we have 13 days to find it before they tear the place down on purpose to sift it out of the rubble." Bertie's flashlight beam came up off the rug and found her mother's face. Theo said, slowly, the way he said the answer to a hard problem when he was sure of it, "Then we better start looking." And it was in that exact moment, with the sun on the herringbone floor and the dust drifting through the light like snow that could not decide to fall, that they all heard it, 400 feet below and 6 floors down, muffled by all that faithful brick. Someone was knocking on the service door. The man at the service door was in his early 50s and dressed the way money dresses when it wants to look like work, a quilted vest over a checked shirt, boots that had never met Mott, and he stepped back 2 polite paces when Mott opened the door and smiled with his whole face, and the smile arrived a half-second before the eyes agreed to join it. "Dale Prather," he said, and put out his hand. "You must be Miss Quinlan. Word travels. I apologize for that. Small town, and I saw the cars, and I confess I have wanted to look inside this old girl my entire life. My grandfather used to talk about the Ambrose like it was a person." He looked past her shoulder into the corridor as he said it. Just for a moment. Just a flick. And Mara watched the flick and heard Aldous's careful hand saying his grandfather came in 1946, and she moved, without hurrying, 6 inches to her left, until she filled the doorway, and she watched the smile notice that she had done it. "I got your offer," she said. Prather held up both hands, pleasant, unarmed. "And there is no rush on that, none at all," he said. "Although, and I hate to be the one, the city's timeline is the city's timeline, And after Tuesday the 23rd, there is frankly nothing left to buy. So it becomes a now or never proposition through no fault of mine. He looked up the brick face of the building, 6 stories, to the copper cornice green against the blue September sky, and something moved through his eyes that was not nostalgia. And Mara thought, "You have counted the windows of this building the way other men count sheep." "Tell you what," Prather said. "You have got kids, I hear, and times are what they are, and demolition costs being what they are. I will make it easy and make it $75,000, Miss Quinlan, cash at signing, this week, and you never think about this pile of brick again." He took a card from the vest pocket and held it out. "My cell is on there. Day or night." Mara took the card. "Because you take the card." "Mr. Prather," she said, "why does your demolition contract say the debris comes to your salvage yard?" The smile stayed. Everything else behind it went very still, the way a pond goes still, and for a count of 3 the September morning stood there between them with the traffic hissing past on First Street, and then Dale Prather laughed, easily, warmly, a beat too late. "Brick like that has resale," he said. "People pay good money for 100-year-old brick. Patios. Feature walls. It is a sideline." He touched an imaginary hat brim to her, and nodded to Mott, and said, "75, this week," and walked back up the alley to a truck that cost more than Mara had earned in 4 years, and they watched him pull out onto First and away. Nobody spoke. Then Gerald Mott, attorney at law, 70 years old, cleared his throat and said, in the tone of a man revising a professional opinion, "Miss Quinlan, I withdraw my earlier remarks about what a lawyer would tell you. That man has never sold a patio brick in his life." Mara looked down at the card in her hand. Heavy stock, raised ink, Prather Group, and then up at the building. Her building, at the one dark eye of 607, catching the light high up at the southeast corner, and she felt the folded pages of Aldous' letter against her ribs where she had put them inside her coat. And she felt something else too, something she had not felt in 3 years, since a Tuesday morning in March with the coffee going cold, and it took her a moment to name it, because it had been away so long. It was the feeling of standing at the start of something instead of the end of something. 13 days, she said. Theo zipped his jacket like a man reporting for work. Bertie put her hand in her mother's, and her other hand around the flashlight Mott had given her, holding it the way a knight holds a sword she has decided to keep. And Mara Quinlan, 39 years old, $1,850 behind on her rent, and the owner of the Ambrose Arms, turned and walked back through the service door into the cool, dry dark that smelled of floor wax and pipe tobacco and 71 years of a kept promise, and pulled the door shut behind her, and turned the locks, all 3, top, middle, bottom, in the order she had been taught. By Friday morning, the whole of Harlow Falls knew that the laundry woman on Delmore Street had turned down $75,000 for a building the city was about to knock down, and Harlow Falls had opinions about it the way a small town always has opinions, loudly, at close range, and mostly to your face. Charlene caught her at the time clock before her shift even started, holding her badge an inch from the reader, and said, "Tell me it isn't true." And when Mara said nothing, only tightened her mouth and clocked in, Charlene said, "Honey, that money doesn't come around twice," and went off shaking her head the way you shake your head at a car accident. Sorry for the wreck, and grateful it isn't yours. By the lunch break, the whole pressing floor had heard, and Ruthann from the folding line said she would have signed it in the parking lot before the ink was dry, and old Delbert, who ran the boiler, said nothing at all, which from Delbert was its own kind of comment, and at the end of the day, he found Mara at her locker and said only, "My father worked construction on that corner in the 50s. Told me once that building's got a heart nobody's found the beat of yet." Then he closed his locker and left before she could ask him what that meant. Denise called twice and left voicemails Mara did not return. And on Saturday, she came by the apartment anyway, without groceries this time, which told Mara how the visit was going to go before Denise said a word. She sat at the kitchen table with her purse still on her shoulder, a woman who had decided in advance she was not staying. "People are saying you're not right in the head, Mara," she said. "I heard it from 3 separate people today. The pressing machine woman thinks she found gold in the walls. Do you understand how that sounds? Do you understand what that does to Theo at school?" Theo, sitting at the far end of the table with his math homework, did not look up, but his pencil stopped moving, and Mara saw it stop. "He got into it twice this week," Denise said, quieter now, not looking at Theo either, which was its own kind of cruelty, talking about a boy in the room as though he were a piece of furniture that might overhear. Some kid called you the crazy hotel lady, and Theo put him into a locker. The school called me because they couldn't reach you, because you were apparently inside a condemned building with no signal. Mara set down the dish towel she had been holding and looked at her son, whose ears had gone red, who was looking very hard at a fraction problem he had clearly already solved twice. Theo, she said, is that true? He got up. He is a liar, Theo said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it the way a boy's voice does when the anger is bigger than the throat carrying it. And he is going to keep being a liar, and I am going to keep telling him to stop, and I am not sorry. And he went into the bedroom he shared with his sister and closed the door, not hard, but firmly, the way a person closes a door when they need you to understand something without shouting it. Denise looked at Mara across the table with an expression that was, for one honest second, not triumph, but real worry, the kind that comes from actually loving someone and not knowing how to say so without sounding like a lecture. I am not trying to be the villain here, she said. I am trying to keep this family from losing the one lucky break it has had in 3 years because you fell in love with a story an old man told you in a letter. Mara did not answer for a moment. Then she said, Denise, when Danny died, you were the one who told me grief makes people see things that are not there. Do you remember that? I remember, Denise said. You told me not to trust my own reading of things for a year. You told me to wait and let smarter people handle the money, and I did. And the hospital sold my debt to a collector inside of 4 months because I waited. I am done waiting on other people's certainty. Denise stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. 40,000 became 75 in 4 days. Mara, she said at the door. That is not nothing. That is a man getting nervous. And nervous men do not stay generous forever. They stay nervous, and then they stop being generous. And I hope to God you know the difference before Tuesday. She left without slamming the door either. And the apartment was very quiet, and Mara stood in her kitchen for a long time before she went and knocked softly on the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed with her son and did not say anything smart, only put her arm around him. And after a while Bertie climbed up on the other side of him with her flashlight, the one Mott had given her, clicking it on and off in the dim room like a small steady heartbeat, and none of them talked about the building at all that night, which was its own kind of talking about it. On Sunday, Mara went back to the Ambrose Arms alone, before the children were awake, because there were things in 607 she needed to face without Bertie's flashlight clicking beside her and without having to keep her voice steady for anyone else's sake. Gerald Mott met her at the service door with the ring of keys and a thermos of coffee and did not ask why she had called him at 7 in the morning on a Sunday, only handed her the thermos cup and said, I brought 2, in case you needed. The second one for company rather than caffeine, and she was grateful for him in a way she had not expected to be grateful for a lawyer. The third shelf in 607 held 41 notebooks, bound in black cloth, numbered on their spines in white ink from 1 to 41, and Mara understood, lifting the first one down, that she was holding a life. The early volumes were a boy's handwriting, careful and slow, the kind of hand a teacher has just finished correcting, and they recorded a messenger's small world, deliveries made, coal hauled. Mr. Ambrose asked after his mail 3 times today, seemed low. Somewhere in the third notebook the handwriting changed, tightened, grew a confidence it had not had before, and the entries changed with it. No longer a boy watching a great man from the edges of a room, but someone who had been let closer in. March the 4th, 1933, one entry read, and Mara's coffee went cold in her hand while she read it standing at the window in the same gold light Aldous must have stood in 1,000 mornings. Mr. Ambrose called me to his office after the others had gone. Told me the president is going to close the banks Monday. Told me he has known it was coming for a month, from a man in Columbus who owes him a debt of the kind you do not put in writing. Told me every dollar he can gather before Monday, he means to gather, and every dollar of it he means to put where the government cannot call it back in, which he says is coming too. He is certain of it. A call for the gold itself, not the paper. I told him that sounds like breaking the law before the law is even written. He looked at me a long time and said, Aldous, the law is going to ask hardworking people to hand over the only money that has never lied to them, in exchange for paper that a man in Washington can print more of whenever he pleases. and I have decided I would rather break a law that has not been written yet than watch every family on this street get poorer waiting on Washington's mercy. He said, "This town fed me for 40 years before it ever bought a bag of my buttons, and I intend to feed it back, but without his name on it, because a man who announces his charity gets robbed of it by other men before the poor ever see a dime." The next dozen entries were sparse, careful, the writing of a boy who had understood by instinct that some pages might someday be read by the wrong eyes. Coal delivery. Boiler serviced. Mr. Ambrose in conference, late. Twice, in April of that year. An entry read only, worked past midnight, said nothing to Ma, and Mara understood those 4 words held more labor than the rest of the notebook combined. Then, dated the 9th of May, 1933, an entry that made her sit down on the edge of the bed with the notebook shaking slightly in her hands. Finished the boiler room floor today. Ambrose had the old coal chute bricked and the new floor poured over it himself. Would not let the regular masons near it. Only myself and one man from out of county who does not speak English and left on the evening train. Told me the room under the boiler room is not on any drawing filed with the city, was dug in 1926 when the building went up, meant then only as a bank vault for his own use. And that is where it has gone, all of it. And the floor above it is poured 6 inches of concrete over the old chute door. And he says a man could stand on that floor his whole life and think it was only a floor. He gave me the 2 words that opened the old chute door from below, in case I am ever the one who has to explain this to someone after him. And he made me swear them to no paper, and I am keeping that oath even now, writing around the very thing he told me not to write. He said, "Aldous, someday this town will need this again, worse than it needs it today, and when that day comes, whoever holds my name will know it by 2 things. They will know it because they have earned the trust of whoever is keeping the door, and they will know it because the day they need it, they will be standing in this building with no other doors left open to them." Mara closed the notebook and sat very still, and Gerald Mott, in the armchair, opened his eyes and looked at her and did not need to ask what she had found, because her face had already told him. "There is a chamber under the boiler room," she said, "poured over in 1933, and the words to open it are not written anywhere. He would not let his own great-nephew put them on paper." Mott exhaled slowly. "Then whatever Aldous told you to find," he said, "he did not mean for you to find it in a notebook. He meant for you to earn it the way he earned it, on his knees, in that boiler room, the same way he learned it." Mara looked down at the small envelope Aldous had left inside the larger one, still sealed, the word after written across it in that same careful hand, and she understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that after did not mean after the letter. It meant after she had found the door herself. The boiler room was in the sub-basement, reached by a second stair off the service corridor, and it took the 2 of them the better part of an hour with flashlights and a floor plan Mott had found rolled in a map tube in the manager's office. Because the sub-basement had no windows at all, and the dark down, there was a different kind of dark than the dark upstairs, older, denser, the kind that seemed to press back against the flashlight beams instead of simply yielding to them. The boiler itself was enormous, a rust-colored cylinder the size of a delivery van, cold and silent, and the floor around it was poured concrete, gray and unbroken except for a wide rectangle near the north wall where the color of the concrete changed very slightly, a shade darker, a texture just faintly different if you crouched and ran a bare hand across it. The way a scar feels different from the skin around it, even after the skin has healed. "This is it," Mara said, and heard her own voice come out very small in that huge cold room. Mott crouched beside her with some difficulty and pressed his palm flat against the seam. 1933, he said, poured by a boy and a stranger who could not speak English and left on the evening train, so he could never be found and asked. He looked up at her. "Miss Quinlan, I am 70 years old, and I have read wills that left grown children weeping and wills that left grown children suing each other over a set of china, and I will tell you honestly, I have never in my career stood over anything like this." She did not answer right away. She was looking at the concrete, at the 2 words she did not have, at a debt 71 years old that had come due on a Sunday morning in a laundry worker's lap. "Mr. Mott," she said finally, "he wrote that whoever holds his name will know it because they earned the trust of whoever was keeping the door, and because on the day they need it, they will have no other doors left. That is us. That is exactly us. but I do not have the words. Aldous never told anyone the words. He kept his oath even after he was dead, which means whoever finds them has to find them the honest way, the way he found the man he became. Mott was quiet a long moment. Then, he said, if I know anything about men like Aldous Finch, and I believe by the end I knew him about as well as any living person did, the answer is not buried any deeper than this floor. It is buried in those notebooks, in the parts he was too careful to write down, but too proud not to leave a trail toward. A man does not spend 71 years guarding 2 words, and then leave no way at all for the right person to find them. That would defeat the entire purpose of guarding them in the first place. He wanted a worthy heir, Miss Quinlan, not a locked door with the key thrown in the river. They went back up to 607, and Mara read every notebook that afternoon, page by page, skimming the maintenance and slowing wherever the ink changed rhythm. And by 4 o'clock, with Mott dozing lightly in the armchair and the light going long and gold through the southeast windows, she found it, not written as an answer, because Aldous had been too careful for that, but written as a question a much younger version of himself had once asked and been given the answer to in person. Notebook 14, an entry from 1958, the year Aldous became superintendent. Mr. Ambrose has been gone 4 years now, and there are still nights I stand over that floor and cannot recall the second word, only the first, which frightens me more than I can say, since I am the only one now living who was ever told either of them. I have taken to writing myself a private drill so the memory does not slip further, and I set it down here in a form no other soul would recognize as anything but an old man's fondness for his own life, since that is exactly what it is. First word, the year the doors opened to the public, cut into the stone above the entrance for anyone to read who cared to look up. Second word, what he told me himself, standing on this very floor the night he told me everything. When I asked him why here, why this room, why not a bank in Columbus where it would have been safer, and he said to me, boy, because a bank is where the world keeps what it owns. This is where I keep what I owe. I have never forgotten the shape of the sentence, even on nights I forget the year. Mara read the entry 3 times, and then she went to the window of 607, unlatched the shutter Aldous had built with his own hands, and looked north and slightly west, down over the boarded roofline toward the corner of Canal and First, where the carved oak leaves ran along the limestone above the entrance, and the name Ambrose stood cut a foot deep into the stone, and below it, smaller, worn nearly smooth by a century of rain. A second line she had noticed on her first morning. Outside and not thought twice about. The way you never think twice about the small print under a name. Established 1926. The first word was the year. 1926. And the second word was O. She did not tell Mott right away. She stood at the window a long moment with the 2 words settled in her like stones dropped into still water. 1926. Oh. And she found she was not ready yet to say them out loud, not because she doubted them, but because saying them would make Monday real in a way it had not been real until this exact second. And some part of her, the tired part, the part that had spent 3 years doing arithmetic at 2 in the morning, wanted 1 more hour of not knowing before the knowing. Changed everything. She told him on the drive home instead, in the Pontiac, with the transmission shuddering through second gear the way it always did, and Gerald Mott sat with his hands folded in his lap and did not say a word until she had finished, and then he said, in a low, careful voice, well, I suppose now we find out what is under the floor, and I suppose we ought to be careful about who knows that we know it. He was right to say so, though neither of them understood yet how right, because word had already begun to move through Harlow Falls the way water moves through a cracked foundation, finding every low place before anyone notices the house is wet. It moved through the county clerk's office, where a title search filed under Mara Quinlan's name that week had crossed the desk of a woman whose brother-in-law did title work for the Prather group on the side. It moved through the demolition contractor's yard, where a foreman mentioned to his crew, in passing, that the old woman lawyer had been seen coming and going from the Ambrose at odd hours with a kid's flashlight and a face like she had found something. It moved, most dangerously of all, through a barstool at the Anchor Tavern on Canal, where Dale Prather sat on Sunday evening with his cell phone face down on the bar and listened to a man named Curtis Vance, who did small jobs for the Prather group that never appeared on any invoice, describe exactly what he had seen through a pair of field glasses from the parking structure across the street that afternoon, A woman standing a long time at an unboarded sixth-floor window, looking down at the stone above the entrance the way a person looks at a word they have just finished reading for the first time. Prather did not say much. He paid for his beer and Curtis Vance's beer and walked out into the evening and sat in his truck in the tavern lot for 11 minutes without starting the engine. And when he finally called the number on his phone, the voice that answered belonged to a man in Columbus whose name did not appear on any Prather group letterhead either. A man whose grandfather had once come to the Ambrose Arms in 1946 with a smile and a story about a debt Sylvan Ambrose supposedly owed his family. A story that had been kept alive at considerable expense and no small discretion for 3 generations precisely because it had never once been proven. And Prather said into the phone, "She's close." And the voice on the other end said, "Then we move the schedule." And Prather said, "The city can't move a demolition permit that fast. There are notices." "There are." And the voice said, "The demolition permit doesn't need to move. The prep crew does. Get them on site Monday morning instead of Tuesday." Fencing, equipment staging, a walkthrough with the engineer, all perfectly legal, all perfectly ordinary, and all of it makes that building an active job site by noon Monday, which means nobody, including her, gets past a chain-link fence without a hard hat and a company escort. And if she has not found what she is looking for by the time that fence goes up, she never will. Mara did not know any of this Sunday night, only that something in the air of the apartment had changed, the way air changes before a storm the county has not yet issued a warning for. And she lay awake with the 2 words turning over in her chest, 1926, oh, and did not sleep until nearly 4. She woke to her phone ringing at 7:15 on Monday morning, and it was Gerald Mott, and his voice had none of its usual unhurried calm in it at all. "Miss Quinlan," he said, "I need you to turn on the local news, or better yet, get down to Canal Street, because there is a fence going up around your building right now, and a Prather Group superintendent standing at the corner telling anyone who asks that the site becomes restricted access as of noon today. And Miss Quinlan, noon today is 9 hours earlier than anyone told either of us it was going to happen." She left the children with Charlene, who had softened enough by Monday morning to take them without a lecture. Only a long look and a squeeze of Mara's arm at the door that said more than any of her Friday comments had. And Mara drove downtown, so fast the Pontiac's transmission complained the entire way, and pulled up on First Street to find exactly what Mott had described. 2 men in orange vests were unrolling a chain-link fence panel along the sidewalk in front of the service alley, and a third stood by a pickup with a clipboard and a hand-painted sign zip-tied to a sawhorse red restricted site. "Authorized personnel only," in letters still tacky with fresh paint. Ma was already there, standing with his cardigan buttoned wrong in his haste, arguing in a low, controlled voice with the man holding the clipboard, and Mara came up beside him just in time to hear the man say, "Ma'am, I don't make the schedule. I just put up the fence, talk to the company." "She is the owner," Mott said, with a patience that was clearly costing him something. "This building is her property, not the Prather Group's, and access to a private structure by its owner of record cannot be restricted by a contractor's staging fence regardless of what that sign says." The man with the clipboard looked at Mara, then at the fence, then back at his clipboard, the way a person looks at a problem they have been paid not to have opinions about, and said only, "I'll call my super." The super, when he arrived 12 minutes later, was not Dale Prather, but a heavy-set man named Pharaoh who had clearly been given very specific instructions and delivered them with the flat courtesy of a man reciting a script. "Ma'am, the site becomes an active job site as of noon per the schedule, and after that it is a liability matter, hard hats, insurance, company escort only. I am sorry, those are the rules." And Mott said, "Those are not the rules. Those are Mr. Prather's preferences dressed up as the rules, and there is a difference. And I intend to file for an emergency order this morning establishing Ms. Quinlan's unrestricted right of access to her own property until such time as the demolition itself is legally executed." And Pharaoh said, "File whatever you want. Counselor, my fence goes up at noon regardless." And it did. All of it. All the way around the block. Chain link and green privacy screening and 2 padlocked gates. And by 12:15 the Ambrose Arms stood behind a fence for the first time in 99 years. Visible only in pieces through gaps in the screening. Its copper cornice catching the noon light above a barrier that made it look, for the first time Mara could remember, exactly as condemned as the newspaper had always said it was. Mott's emergency filing bought them until 8 o'clock that evening. A county judge named Everly, roused from a Monday lunch by a call from an old friend at the courthouse, signed a temporary order granting the owner of record supervised access between the hours of 5 and 8 p.m. Pending a full hearing Wednesday morning, a hearing that Mara understood, reading the order in Mott's car with her hands not quite steady, would happen one full day after the demolition crews were scheduled to arrive with equipment, which meant the order was not a victory. It was a 3-hour window, and after 8 o'clock tonight, whatever happened next would happen with a fence around it, and a Prather group foreman standing at the gate. Word of the fence went through Harlow Falls faster than word of the $75,000 ever had, because a fence is a thing you can see with your own eyes on your lunch break, and by 4 o'clock a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk outside the chain link. The way small towns gather outside any spectacle, some of them curious, some of them there to see the crazy hotel lady finally get what was coming to her, and Mara, arriving at 4:45 with Theo and Bertie and a canvas bag of tools borrowed from Delbert's own garage, had to walk through that crowd to reach the gate, and she felt every eye on her the way she had felt eyes on her at the school pickup line for 3 years. Except this time Theo did not look at the ground. He walked half a step ahead of his mother and his sister, 12 years old, in a jacket 2 winters old, and when a man near the gate said, loud enough to carry, "There she is, the treasure hunter," Theo turned and looked at him, not angry, just steady, the way his mother had learned to be steady over the pressing machine, and said, "My great-uncle kept a promise for 71 years, and my mom is finishing it. And if that is funny to you, that is your problem, not ours." And the crowd went quiet. In the particular way a crowd goes quiet when a child has just said something none of the adults present have the nerve to. It was Delbert who broke the silence, stepping out from where he had been standing at the back with his arms crossed, an old man in a canvas coat who nobody at the laundry had ever heard say 3 sentences in a row, and he said, to the crowd generally and to no one in particular, "My father laid brick on that corner in 1951. And he used to tell me the Ambrose was the only building in this town that fed people through the Depression without ever putting its name on a single loaf of bread, because Sylvan Ambrose thought a man ought to be able to eat without being reminded who was feeding him." He looked at the fence, at the green screening hiding 6 stories of dark brick. "Man built this town's memory of what decent money looks like," he said. "Be a shame if the last thing that corner is remembered for is somebody else's fence." The gate opened at 5 exactly, and Pharaoh stood at it with a clipboard and a company escort who turned out to be Curtis Vance, the same man who had watched from the parking structure the day before with field glasses, and who now stood by the service door with his arms folded and his eyes moving over Mara and the children and Mott and the canvas bag of tools with an attention that had nothing to do with liability. 3 hours, Pharaoh said. "I'll be right here." They went down into the sub-basement together, the 4 of them and Mott, with flashlights and a masonry hammer and a cold chisel from Delbert's garage, and the boiler room felt larger and colder than it had on Sunday, the way any room feels larger when a clock has been set running somewhere above it. And Mara knelt at the seam in the concrete with the chisel in one hand and the hammer in the other, and her children on either side of her, holding flashlights steady, and she thought of Aldous Finch at 16 years old kneeling on this same spot with a stranger who did not speak English, pouring 6 inches of concrete over a promise. And she thought of her grandmother at a switchboard 3 floors up, laughing at something outside the frame, carrying a silence for the rest of her life so that this exact moment could someday exist. And she set the edge of the chisel against the seam, and Bertie, 7 years old, put her small hand flat against her mother's shoulder, the way you steady someone you love before they do something that cannot be undone, and said, "We're ready, Mom." And Theo said nothing at all, only held the light very still, and outside, up 2 flights and across the lobby and out past a fence that had not existed a day before, the sun over Harlow Falls had begun, very slowly, to go down toward Monday evening. The concrete did not want to give. That was the first thing Mara learned, on her knees in the cold with her shoulders already aching after 10 minutes. That 92 years of curing had turned Sylvan Ambrose's secret into something closer to stone than to the poured gray slab it had once been, and each strike of the hammer against the chisel sent a shock up through her wrists that she felt in her teeth, and the sound of it rang off the boiler and the low ceiling and came back at her doubled, a hard flat clap that seemed far too loud for a room nobody was supposed to be able to hear from the street. Mott held the second flashlight and after 20 minutes insisted on taking a turn with the hammer himself, which Mara would not have believed possible from a 70-year-old man in reading glasses if she had not watched him do it, swinging with a controlled, economical motion that spoke of a life that had not always been spent behind a desk. And when she asked him about it later, much later, he only said that a man grows up on a farm in this county, or he does not, and left it at that. By 6:30 they had opened a channel along one edge of the seam, 4 inches wide, and perhaps 2 inches deep, enough to see that the concrete here was thinner than the slab around it, poured as a patch rather than as part of the original floor, exactly as the notebook had promised, and Theo, taking his turn with the chisel, while his mother caught her breath and shook the ache out of her hands, struck a blow that did not ring the way the others had. It landed with a duller sound, a sound with give in it, and a fine seam of black opened along the channel they had cut, not the gray of concrete, but the deeper black of open air beneath, and all 4 of them went very still and looked at that thin dark line the way you look at the first light under a door you have been standing outside your entire life. There, Bertie whispered, and pointed her flashlight straight down into it, and the beam found nothing but more dark, because the gap was too narrow yet to show anything at all, only the fact of itself, a seam of hollow space where for 92 years there had only ever been floor. It was at that exact moment that Curtis Vance's voice came down the stairwell, sharper than it needed to be for a man simply checking the time. 20 minutes, folks, he called, and his footsteps started down the stairs before anyone answered him, which was not what a company escort did if he was only there to watch a clock, and Mara looked at Mott, and Mott looked at the narrow black seam in the floor, still 4 feet from being anything a person could reach an arm into, let alone climb down through, and understood in the same instant she did that Curtis Vance was coming to see exactly how close they had gotten, so that he could report it to a man in a truck outside, so that a phone call could go to a voice in Columbus who had been waiting 80 years for precisely this kind of news. Mott straightened up faster than Mara had seen him move all day and stepped between the boiler and the stairs, holding his flashlight up almost casually, the way a man holds a flashlight when he wants it to look like he is simply lighting his own way rather than blocking a line of sight, and said, loudly, cheerfully, in the voice of a man narrating a disappointment for an audience, "Well, Miss Quinlan, I believe that is quite enough for one evening. This concrete is a good deal more stubborn than either of us expected." And Vance came around the boiler and found 4 tired people standing over a channel of broken concrete that, from where he stood with his own light aimed low and at an angle, could easily have passed for nothing more than an old crack widened by a few discouraged swings of a hammer. And Vance looked at it for 3 long seconds, and looked at Mara, and said, "Pharaoh wants everybody up top, gates closing at 8 sharp," and turned and went back up the stairs without waiting to see that they followed, which told Mara that whatever he had seen or not seen, he had decided it was not worth staying to look harder, at least not yet, at least not with Mott standing there watching him do it. They walked out through the gate at 7:58, into a Monday evening gone the color of a bruise, purple and orange low over the rooftops of Canal Street, and Pharaoh locked the padlock behind them himself, testing it with a tug the way a man tests a lock when he has been told specifically to make sure of it, and said, "Same time tomorrow, if the judge says so," in a tone that made clear he did not expect the judge to say so, or did not expect there to be a tomorrow that mattered by the time any judge weighed in. Mara stood on the sidewalk with her children and watched the padlock catch the last of the light, and thought about a 4-foot channel of broken concrete 40 feet below that padlock, a thread of black seam that had taken 3 hours and every ounce of strength in her arms to open. And she thought about Pharaoh's demolition crew due back at 7 the next morning with equipment that could turn that whole sub-basement, boiler and floor and hidden chamber and 92 years of a kept promise, into gravel inside of an hour, long before any Wednesday hearing could stop it. And she understood, standing there with the padlock glinting at her, that the temporary order Mott had won that morning had never been a path to Tuesday at all. It had only ever been a way of buying one evening. And the evening was over, and the fence was locked, and somewhere inside that fence was a hole in a floor that was 3 feet from being wide enough to climb through and 100 years too old to leave half open. Mott drove them home in silence for the first mile, his hands tied on the wheel in a way that did not suit him, and then he said, Without looking away from the road, Miss Quinlan, I want to be very clear with you about something, because I have sworn an oath to this county's laws and I intend to keep it, and I cannot in good conscience advise you to do what I suspect you are already turning over in your mind. Mara looked out the window at Delmore Street sliding past, at the mailboxes in the lobby where a cream-colored envelope had once sat waiting to change everything, and said, "You don't have to advise me to do anything, Mr. Mott. You already told me the truth this morning. That order gave me access I already had a right to. A locked gate does not erase an owner's right to her own property. It only makes exercising that right a great deal more complicated, and possibly," he paused, "possibly a matter for the same judge to sort out after the fact rather than before it." He pulled up outside the apartment building and put the car in park and sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. "I am 70 years old," he said finally. "I have spent 41 years keeping one promise for a dead man because he asked me to, and because it turned out to be worth keeping. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am not finished keeping promises yet. If you decide tonight is the night, Miss Quinlan, you will not decide it alone, and that is the last I am going to say about the wisdom of it, because wisdom, in my experience, is very often just fear with a law degree, and some things are worth being unwise for." Mara looked at her children in the back seat, Bertie half asleep against Theo's shoulder, Theo wide awake and watching her in the rearview mirror with an expression that was not a child's expression at all, and she thought of a boy of 16 kneeling on wet concrete beside a man who could not speak English, keeping a promise before he had any way of knowing what the promise would someday cost him. And she thought of her grandmother's laugh caught forever behind glass on a third-floor landing. And she thought of a fence and a padlock and a crew arriving at 7 the next morning, with machines built to turn a century into rubble in an afternoon. And she said it low, barely above the engine noise, so soft Mott had to lean toward her to catch it. "Then we go back tonight, Mr. Mott, before that fence opens for anyone but us." They did not tell Charlene the whole truth. Only that Mara needed the children watched past midnight, and Charlene, standing on her own porch in a bathrobe with a look on her face that said she had already guessed more than she was letting on, took Bertie's hand and said, "Go on, honey, whatever it is," and did not ask again. Theo refused to be left. He stood in Charlene's doorway with his jaw set the exact way his father's had set when Danny meant something and did not intend to argue about it twice, and said, "Mom, I held the light for 3 hours today. I am not staying home while you finish it without me." And Mara, who had spent 3 years trying to give her children a childhood soft enough that they would never have to be as brave as she had needed to be, looked at her son and understood that she had failed at that particular ambition. A long time ago, probably on the morning the eviction notice was taped at Bertie's eye level, and that the failure had made him this instead, and she was no longer entirely sure it was a failure at all. "Fine," she said. "But you do exactly what I say, the second I say it." He said he would. Delbert met them at 11, in the alley off First Street 2 blocks down from the fence, with his own truck and a coil of rope and a battery lantern brighter than anything Mott had brought the day before, and he did not ask why they needed him, only said, "My father would never forgive me if I let that building come down with its secret still in it and me standing around doing nothing about it," and helped Mott ease a gap in the chain link wide enough for a grown man to pass through, working a tension bar loose from a fence post with the patient, unhurried competence of someone who had spent a working life solving problems with his hands rather than his mouth. The green privacy screening hid them from the street entirely, which Mara understood, standing in the dark lot with the Ambrose Arms rising black against a sky gone fully to night above her. Was the first time in 6 years that the town had not been able to see this building even if it had wanted to. And there was something in that thought, some old ache under the fear. A building finally alone with the people who had always actually loved it, unwatched by anyone who only wanted to sift it for what it hid. The service door opened on its faithful hinges without a sound, the way it always had, and they went down through the dark lobby with its coffered ceiling swallowed entirely by night, past the wall of brass mailboxes where 607 still hung, closed high above them like a held breath, down the second stair into the sub-basement, for flashlight beams and one battery lantern converging on a channel of broken concrete that seemed, in the full dark, both smaller and more enormous than it had. At 7 o'clock that evening, a black seam running 4 feet across a floor that had kept a promise since 1933 and had perhaps 2 hours left, by Mara's best guess, before a demolition crew's alarm clocks began going off across Harlow Falls for a 7 a.m. start. She knelt at the seam again, chisel in one hand, hammer in the other, her palms already raw from the afternoon's work, and Bertie knelt beside her with the small flashlight steady in both hands. And Theo took up the second hammer without being asked, and Delbert braced a pry bar into the widening gap the way a man braces a bar who has done this kind of work his whole life, without ever once expecting it to matter this much. And Gerald Mott, 70 years old, stood over all of them holding the lantern high, the last light of an old promise, and said, "Lo," into the cold underground dark, "All right, Miss Quinlan. Let's finish what he started." The first hour underground moved the way real labor always moves, slower than fear and faster than hope. For people trading turns at the chisel, while the fifth held the light, the channel widening inch by stubborn inch, concrete dust settling into their hair and their throats until the whole boiler room smelled of stone and sweat, and the particular mineral chill of air that had not moved in 92 years. Somewhere near 1 in the morning, Theo's hammer struck a section that gave all at once, a long slab tipping inward with a grinding crack that echoed up through the empty building like a door finally deciding, after nearly a century, to open, and a section of the old floor the size of a car had dropped away into the dark beneath it and was gone. And for one long moment nobody moved, nobody breathed. For flashlight beams and a lantern all swinging at once toward the ragged black mouth that had just opened in the sub-basement floor of the Ambrose Arms, and up out of that opening came a smell none of them had a name for yet, cold stone and old paper and something faintly, impossibly sweet, like a cellar that had been sealed with its harvest still inside it. And Bertie's hand found her mother's sleeve and gripped it hard, and Mara Quinlan, 39 years old, knelt at the edge of a hole that had taken a boy of 16 and a stranger who could not speak English to close in 1933, and looked down into a darkness that had been waiting, patiently, faithfully, for exactly this night, and said, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Somebody hand me the lantern." Nobody handed it to her right away. For one breath they all simply knelt there in the broken circle of light, 5 people and a hole in the floor between them, listening to a building that had kept 100 years' secret hold what sounded, absurdly, impossibly, like its own breath along with them. And then Delbert reached out and pressed the lantern handle into Mara's raw and trembling palm, and said, in a voice that barely carried past the boiler beside them, "Go on then." He waited a long time for somebody worth waiting for. Mott set a steadying hand on Theo's shoulder before the boy could lean too far over the broken edge, and Bertie's flashlight beam did not waver once, held rock steady in both small hands as though she had been training her whole short life for exactly this one job. And above them, 6 floors up, a small brass door numbered 607 stood shut in the dark the way it had stood shut for 30 years, waiting, the same as everything else in that building, to finally be finished waiting. Mara lowered the lantern toward the opening, and the light went down into it ahead of her, and for the first time in 92 years, the dark under the Ambrose Arms began, slowly, to answer back. The lantern light found stone steps first, narrow ones cut into the foundation itself, descending 8 feet into a chamber no wider than the boiler room above it, and Mara went down them on legs that did not feel entirely like her own, one hand braced against a wall that had not felt open air since a stranger who could not speak English caught the evening train out of Harlow Falls in 1933. The chamber was dry. That was the second thing she noticed, after the cold, a bone-dry, mineral stillness that meant the seal had held perfectly for 92 years, and the lantern light, swinging slowly across the room as she reached the floor, found rows of wooden crates stacked along the north wall, and beside them, on shelving built into the stone itself, canvas sacks gone stiff with age, and stacked in neat pyramids on a low table at the center of the room. Dozens upon dozens of gold coins, $20 pieces, their eagles and liberty heads catching the lantern light and throwing it back in small hard points across the ceiling like a second, private sky. Theo came down behind her, then Bertie, holding tight to Delbert's hand on the narrow steps, and then Mott, moving carefully, his flashlight beam joining the lanterns until the little room was as bright as it had ever likely been, brighter than it had been the day it was sealed, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all, because there was nothing in any of their lives that had prepared a sentence for this. Delbert was the one who finally spoke, and what he said was not what Mara expected. "He is not laughing," he said, looking at nothing in particular, at the low stone ceiling, the way a man looks at a room he suspects is still occupied. "My father used to say a good man's work outlives him quiet as a held breath. I always thought that was just something he said." Mara knelt at the low table between the pyramids of coins, and beside them, wrapped in oilcloth exactly like the bundle George Carter had once handed a stranger in a story none of them had ever heard, she found a ledger, bound in the same black cloth as Aldous's 41 notebooks, but far older, its cover cracked and pale at the corners, and across the front, in a hand steadier and more ornate than Aldous's boyish script. One word: Ode. She opened it with hands that would not quite stop shaking. The first page was dated March of 1933, and it was not a list of treasure. It was a list of people. Names, addresses, small notes in a careful accountant's hand. Warren and Alma Dietz, 41 Larch Street. For children, mill closed, 6 months back on rent owed to nobody but themselves. They will not ask. Watch for them. The Kowalski family, Elm and Ninth. Father lost the hand-press job in December. Boy has TB. Dr. Bill unpaid. Ruth Okonkwo, widow, 2 rooms above the hardware store, takes in mending, proud. Will refuse if offered outright. Find another way. Page after page, name after name. 311 households by Mara's later count, and beside nearly every name, a dollar figure, modest by the standards of the coins stacked a few feet away. $20 here, 60 there, once in a while as much as 200, and Mara understood, reading it by lantern light with her children pressed against her shoulders and Gerald Mott gone very still behind her, that she was not looking at a hoard at all. She was looking at a debt. Sylvan Ambrose had not converted his fortune into gold to hide it from the world. He had converted it into gold to keep a promise to 311 families in a town that was drowning, and then, before he could pay a fraction of it out, the banks had failed harder and faster than even he had predicted, and men from Columbus had begun circling his fortune the way men circle any large visible thing in hard times, and rather than let that money be seized, taxed, litigated, or simply stolen by whoever moved fastest, he had done the only thing a frightened, stubborn, generous man could think to do. He had buried his own guilt under a boiler room floor and told a 16-year-old boy to wait for someone worth trusting with it, because he had run out of time to distribute it himself, and dying men, Mara thought, kneeling on the stone floor with the ledger open in her lap, do not always get to finish what they start. Sometimes all they can do is choose who finishes it for them. It was Mott who reminded her, gently, that there was still a second envelope, the smaller one, sealed, the word after written across its face in Aldous's careful hand, and that whatever it held had been meant for exactly this moment and no other. And Mara sat on the cold stone floor of a chamber that had waited 92 years for her and opened it with the ledger still open across her knees. Inside were 2 pages, dated the same year as the letter she had already read, and the handwriting here was even more careful than usual, the hand of a man choosing every word the way another man might choose every stone in a wall meant to hold. "If you have found this," Aldous had written, "then you have found the ledger too, and you understand now what I could never explain in a letter that might have fallen into the wrong hands. This was never mine, and it was never truly Sylvan's. Either, not by the end. It belongs to the town, or rather it belongs to the town's own dead and their children's children, and I want you to hear me clearly on what I am about to ask, because it is not a suggestion, it is the only condition on which I ever intended this to reach you at all. Find the families on that list, or their descendants where the families themselves are gone. Pay every debt to the dollar Sylvan recorded, adjusted fair for what a dollar was worth then against what it is worth now, and let a court or an honest accountant set that fairness, not your own conscience, which will want to give away more than you can afford and call it penance for sins that are not yours to carry. What remains after the debt is paid is yours, free and clear, yours to raise your children on, yours to fix a roof or buy a car that starts in the morning, or simply to finally rest. I do not say this because I doubt your goodness. I say it because I watched goodness undo a man I loved like a father, watched him try to give away more than any one man could carry and nearly lose himself to the weight of it, and I will not let his mistake become yours as well. There is one more thing. The building itself. I have left instructions with Gerald for a trust, one he does not yet know the shape of because I never told him, and I am telling you now instead. The Ambrose Arms is not to be sold to Prather or to anyone who wants only the corner it sits on. It is to be restored, in part with this money, and it is to remain open in some form to the town that fed me when I had nothing. Because Sylvan taught me that a building can be a kind of promise too, standing there every day reminding a street of what it once meant to take care of each other. Do with the rest of your life what you will, Mara. You owe no one anything beyond what is written in that ledger. But I hope, when it is done, you will let this old building go on being what it was always meant to be, which is not a vault, and never was, not really. It was always just a very large, very patient way of saying thank you. He had signed it the same way as the first letter, only his name, no flourish, and beneath the signature, in slightly fresher ink, as though added some later year when his hand had grown less steady, one final line. Watch the sky through the boarded windows before you decide anything. If it still looks like a town worth saving, you will already know what to do. Mara folded the pages against her chest and closed her eyes for a long moment in the lantern light. And when she opened them, Bertie was looking up at her with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old who understands that something enormous has just happened without understanding all of what it is. And Theo had gone very still beside her the way he went still when he was working out a problem that had no clean answer. And Delbert stood with his cap in his hands the way men of his generation stood in rooms that asked for it. And Gerald Mott, 70 years old, 41 years a promise keeper himself, wiped his glasses on his cardigan and did not manage to get them entirely clean before he put them back on. We do not have long, he said finally, his voice rough in a way Mara had not heard from him before. It is nearly 4 in the morning, Miss Quinlan and Pharaoh's crew will be on site at 7, and I strongly suggest that whatever we do next, we do it in a way that puts this discovery in front of people who cannot make it disappear before anyone official has seen it with their own eyes. They worked fast after that. The way people work when a clock has stopped being an abstraction and become something they can hear ticking in their own chest. Mott called the county judge's clerk from his cell phone the moment they climbed back up into the sub-basement, leaving a message that would sit unheard until business hours, but that time stamped, officially, the discovery at 4:17 in the morning, a detail he insisted mattered more than it seemed to. Mara photographed the chamber from every angle her phone would allow, the coins, the crates, the ledger open to its first page, and uploaded every image to the same cloud account she had set up for the estate documents. Because a lawyer of 41 years standing had taught her that a thing which exists in 3 places at once is a great deal harder to make disappear than a thing that exists in only one. Delbert drove to the all-night gas station on Route 9 and came back with coffee for everyone and, more usefully, with a young reporter named Priya Adeyemi from the Harlow Falls Courier, whom he had once coached in youth softball and who answered her phone at 5 in the morning for exactly 2 people in this world, her mother and her old coach, and who arrived at the fence 20 minutes later with a camera bag and an expression that told Mara she had already guessed this was not going to be a small story. They let her in through Delbert's gap in the chain link the same way they had let themselves in, and Priya stood at the edge of the broken floor with her camera light, throwing the chamber into stark relief, gold and stone and 92 years of careful waiting, and said, very softly, for a woman whose job depended on rarely being at a loss for words, I need to sit down for a second. By 6:30 the story existed in more places than any single person could have erased, even with unlimited money and no conscience at all. A set of time-stamped photographs on a cloud drive, a sworn voicemail sitting in a judge's inbox, a reporter's own images already backed up to her paper server, and Priya herself typing the first draft of an article on her phone while sitting on an overturned crate in a 100-year-old vault, because, she said, if I don't file something before anyone, with Money Wakes Up, this becomes a story about a lawsuit instead of a story about what actually happened, and I am not going to let that happen to Aldous Finch. It was Theo who saw the headlights first, coming down First Street too fast for 6:45 in the morning, and Mara came up out of the sub-basement in time to see, through a gap in the green privacy screening, Pharaoh's pickup pull in beside the padlocked gate, and Pharaoh himself get out, and stand looking at a chain-link fence with a section pried loose and folded back like a page turned in a book, and reach immediately, wordlessly, for his phone. Dale Prather arrived at 7:11, not in the truck he usually drove, but in a black sedan that looked freshly washed even at that hour, and he did not come alone. The man who got out of the passenger side was older, perhaps 75, silver-haired in the specific brushed-back way of men who have paid the same barber for 40 years, wearing a topcoat that belonged to a much colder city than Harlow Falls. And Mott, standing beside Mara at the gate, went very still at the sight of him in a way Mara had not seen from him before, not even at the reading of the will. "Warwick Colby," Mott murmured, low enough that only she could hear it. "I have not seen that man in person in 15 years, and I never once expected to see him standing on this street." Colby crossed the sidewalk without hurrying, the way men hurry only when hurrying costs them nothing, and stopped in front of the folded-back section of fence and looked at it, and then at Mara, and said, in a voice as carefully brushed as his hair, "Miss Quinlan, I believe. My name is Warwick Colby. My grandfather was Elias Colby, who partnered with Sylvan Ambrose in the pearl button trade for 11 years before Mr. Ambrose, shall we say, restructured their arrangement rather more to his own benefit than my grandfather's, in the winter of 1933. My family has spent 3 generations trying to establish what became of the assets my grandfather was owed from that partnership. I understand you have found something interesting under this building overnight." He said it pleasantly, the way a man asks about the weather, but his eyes went past Mara to the fence gap, to the sub-basement stairwell beyond it, with an attention that had nothing pleasant in it at all. Mara felt Theo's hand find hers, and did not let go of it. "Mr. Colby," she said, and was faintly surprised at how steady her own voice came out. "I have read every word Sylvan Ambrose wrote about that winter, in his own hand, dated as it happened, kept by a witness who has no reason on earth to lie for a dead man's benefit, and nothing in any of it describes a partnership restructured to anyone's disadvantage. It describes a man converting his own money, his own, Mr. Colby, into gold because he believed correctly that the country was about to make holding it illegal, and then choosing to keep that gold here rather than let it be seized or taxed away from the people he actually meant to give it to. If your grandfather was owed money from a button business, that is a matter between your family and a probate court from 1935, and I would be very surprised if it were not settled decades before either of us was born." Colby's pleasant expression did not change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps the button business was simply the easiest thing to prove on paper, and the harder thing, the larger thing, was never resolved because Mr. Ambrose was extremely careful about what he let anyone put on paper." He glanced at Prather, who had said nothing this entire time, standing a half-step behind him with his hands in his coat pockets, and an expression Mara could not read at all. "I have spent a great deal of money over a great many years establishing a legal position for exactly this morning, Miss Quinlan, and I intend to use it. Whatever is in that hole in the ground is the subject of at minimum 3 overlapping claims, mine among them, and I would strongly advise you not to remove one further item from that chamber, nor allow that young woman with the camera to publish one further photograph, until this matter has been properly adjudicated, which in my experience takes years, during which time, I should add, nothing at all prevents this demolition from proceeding as scheduled, since a legal dispute over ownership of contents is an entirely separate matter from the structural condition of the building containing them, and the building, Miss Quinlan, remains condemned regardless of what turns out to be underneath it." It was Gerald Mott who answered him, and he did it in the voice Mara imagined he must have used in courtrooms 40 years ago, before his hair went white and his practice shrank down to the quiet estates of a shrinking town, a voice with no cardigan softness left in it at all. "Mr. Colby," he said, "I have represented this estate since Aldous Finch was very much alive, and I would like to inform you of 3 facts before you say anything further that your own attorneys will regret. First, the article describing everything you have just told this young woman, including your name, your grandfather's name, and the precise legal theory you have apparently spent decades and a great deal of money constructing, is at this moment sitting in the queue of the Harlow Falls Courier's website, time-stamped and witnessed, and will publish within the hour regardless of anything either of us does between now and then, because I made certain of that 30 minutes ago." Priya Adeyemi, standing at the edge of the group with her phone already recording, did not smile, exactly, but something in her posture straightened. "Second," Mott went on, The ledger recovered from that chamber this morning is a complete accounting, in Sylvan Ambrose's own hand, of every dollar he owed and to whom, dated contemporaneously to the events you are describing, and it does not mention Elias Colby, your grandfather, or any button partnership whatsoever, which strongly suggests that whatever dispute existed between them was resolved to both men's satisfaction well before 1933, or it would certainly have appeared on a list this meticulous. And third, he said, and here his voice dropped, not softer, but heavier, the way a stone drops rather than a feather. The demolition order for this building was accelerated by 9 hours yesterday morning under circumstances my office is already formally requesting the city investigate, specifically who requested that acceleration, on whose authority, and whether any communication exists between the Prather group and any city official regarding that timeline in the weeks preceding it. I would be very surprised, Mr. Colby, if a records request covering the last 6 months of correspondence between your associate here and the mayor's office turned up nothing at all of interest. Dale Prather, who had not spoken since arriving, shifted his weight in a way that told Mara everything Mott's sentence had not quite said outright, and Curtis Vance, who had come around from the far side of the fence to stand near Pharaoh, went very carefully expressionless, the particular stillness of a man doing quiet arithmetic about which side of a collapsing deal he intended to still be standing on by lunchtime. Colby's pleasant mask held for another 3 seconds, and then, almost imperceptibly, it did not. That is an extraordinary allegation, Counselor, he said. It is an extraordinary Tuesday, Mott said. I find the two tend to travel together. It was Curtis Vance, in the end, who broke the standoff, and he did it in the flat, resigned voice of a man who has decided that whatever loyalty he owed Dale Prather did not extend as far as a felony. Mr. Prather, he said, I think you ought to know I took photos of my own, Sunday night, from the parking structure, on your instruction, and I sent them to your phone same as you asked, and I still have every one of them time-stamped on mine. And I also think you ought to know I was standing right here Monday morning when that call came through about moving the fence up 9 hours, and you took it outside so I wouldn't hear. Except the door didn't latch all the way, and I heard plenty. He looked at Mott, not at Prather, when he said the rest. I do landscaping and hauling for the Prather group, Mr. Mott, not felonies, and I am not going to stand here and let anybody tell a judge later that I did. Prather's face, for the first time all morning, lost its composure entirely, and he turned on Vance with a look that made Pharaoh take an involuntary step backward, but whatever he meant to say died in his throat. Because at that exact moment 2 more vehicles came down First Street, a Harlow Falls police cruiser and, behind it, a county sheriff's SUV, both of them responding not to any call from Mara or Mott, but to a 911 placed 40 minutes earlier by Priya Adeyemi's editor, who had read her half-filed draft over the phone at 6:15 that morning and decided, with the instincts of a man who had run a small-town paper for 30 years, that a story this size needed official eyes on it before anyone with money got the chance to make the evidence vanish without a trace. Officer Delacroix Whitfield, a broad, unhurried man Mara recognized from Bertie's school crossing on Larch Street, got out of the cruiser first, looked at the fence, the gathered group, the reporter with her phone still recording, and said, in the tone of a man who has learned that the first thing to do in a strange situation is slow it down. All right, folks. Nobody's going anywhere until I understand what I'm looking at. So why don't we start from the beginning, and somebody tell me why. There's a hole cut in a construction fence at 7 in the morning. It took the better part of 2 hours to sort out on the sidewalk, and then the better part of the morning to sort out properly, with a city engineer summoned from home to actually walk the sub-basement for the first time in 6 years and confirm, with visible embarrassment, that the structural report his own office had filed contained photographs that upon closer inspection appeared to have been taken through the boarded ground floor windows and nowhere else, never once past the service door. And with a county assistant district attorney arriving by 10 to take statements, and with the demolition permit itself placed on emergency administrative hold by a deputy mayor who had clearly been woken up by a phone call she did not enjoy receiving. Warwick Colby left before any of that, in the black sedan, without another word to anyone, and Dale Prather left not long after him, on foot, having apparently decided the sedan was no longer available to him, and Mara watched him go down Canal Street with his hands in his pockets and felt, to her own surprise, not triumph exactly, but something closer to the tired relief of setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had nearly forgotten it had a shape. Priya's article ran at 9:40 that morning under a headline her editor had rewritten twice before he was satisfied. The promise under the floor, and by noon it had been picked up by a wire service out of Columbus, and by evening a reporter from a Cincinnati television station was standing on Canal Street doing a live shot with the fenced building behind her, and Mara, watching it on Charlene's kitchen television with her arm around Bertie and Theo pretending very hard not to care while sitting close enough to see the screen perfectly, understood that the town's arithmetic about her had changed overnight in the way a town's arithmetic can only change when the story turns out to be true. Charlene cried during the segment and did not apologize for it. Ruth in from the folding line sent a text that just said, "I am so sorry," and Mara, uncharacteristically, did not feel the need to hold on to the apology as a grievance, only read it and set the phone down and let it go. Because holding on to every small unkindness from a hard year seemed, suddenly, like a luxury she no longer needed to afford. Denise came by on Thursday, 3 days later, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment before she came in, and did not bring groceries, and did not sit down right away either. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not have its usual certainty in it at all. "I said some things," she said, "about you not being right in the head. About you falling in love with a story an old man told you." She looked at the floor of Mara's small kitchen, the same floor she had stood on delivering her Saturday lecture, and said, "I have thought a lot this week about how quick I was to tell you what to do with your own life, and how little I ever asked you what you actually wanted from it, and I am not proud of that." Mara did not make her stand there and apologize longer than she needed to. She crossed the kitchen and hugged her sister-in-law the way you hug someone you have loved imperfectly through a hard stretch of years, and Denise held on longer than either of them expected, and when she finally stepped back, she wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and said, in something closer to her old voice, "Well, are you at least going to let me help you figure out what an appraiser charges to value 900 gold coins? Because I guarantee you the bank has opinions." And Mara laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in longer than 3 years. The appraisal, when it finally came, took the better part of 6 weeks, conducted jointly by a numismatic firm out of Cleveland and a bullion assessor retained by the estate's own accountant, working under the supervision of the probate court and, at Gerald Mott's insistence, photographed and logged at every stage so that no single figure would ever rest on any one person's word alone. The gold itself, coin and bar together, came to just over $86 million at the assessed weight and purity, a number so large that Mara heard it read aloud in Judge Everly's courtroom and did not, for several seconds, understand it as a sentence about her own life rather than a sentence about someone else's. The debts recorded in Sylvan Ambrose's ledger, adjusted for value by a court-appointed economist the way Aldous had insisted they must be, came to just under $3 million, owed across 286 identifiable descendant households still traceable in the county and beyond, the Dietzes and the Kowalskis and Ruth Okonkwo's grandchildren, and, to everyone's quiet astonishment, Delbert's own family, because his grandfather, it turned out, had laid the very first brick on that corner in 1926 and never once in his life been paid the final week's wages Ambrose's foreman had owed him when the bank closed its doors, a debt of $11 that Sylvan had recorded and never gotten the chance to make right, and that Delbert received, adjusted for 92 years of accrued value, as a check for $4,100, which he folded into his coat pocket without comment and did not discuss again except once, months later, to say only that his father would have liked knowing the old man never forgot. What remained after every debt had been paid, verified, and distributed came to just over $83 million, and Mara spent more sleepless nights over that number than she had ever spent over the eviction notice. Not because she doubted it was hers, the court had settled that cleanly enough by the second hearing, but because a number that size did not come with instructions the way the smaller, harder years had, and she found herself, more than once, standing in her kitchen at 2 in the morning out of old habit, doing arithmetic that no longer needed doing at all. Gerald Mott helped her find a fiduciary in Columbus who did not treat her like a woman who had simply gotten lucky, a careful, plain-spoken woman named Adiz Brandt, who spent their first meeting asking Mara what she actually wanted her life to look like in 5 years rather than what she wanted to buy, and Mara, who had not been asked that question by anyone in longer than she could remember, found she had to think about it for a full minute before she could answer. She paid off the collection agency that had bought Danny's hospital debt, a phone call that took 4 minutes, and left her sitting on the floor of her bedroom afterward for the better part of an hour, not crying exactly, just breathing. The way you breathe after finally setting down something you had carried so long your shoulders had grown around its shape. She bought the Delmore Street building outright, not to leave it, but so that no landlord could ever again tape an eviction notice at her daughter's eye level. And then, because Mr. Petrakis turned out to be nearly as tired as she had once been and glad to be rid of the headache, she kept every tenant's rent exactly where it stood and fixed the boiler that had gone out twice that winter, and told nobody in the building why, and let them assume it was simply a new landlord doing the ordinary, decent thing that ordinary decent landlords were supposed to do all along. She bought a car with a transmission that did not shudder through second gear, though she kept the old Pontiac, rust and all, parked behind the Ambrose Arms where it sat for years afterward like a monument to every mile it had once carried her, and Theo, when he got his license 2 years later, insisted on learning to drive on it first. Out of some stubborn 12-14-year-old loyalty Mara never fully understood and never once discouraged. The Ambrose Arms itself took the better part of 18 months to restore. Under a trust Mott drew up exactly the shape Aldous had asked for though never described. Structural repairs first. The fourth-floor ceiling that had brought down the city's condemnation finally shored and finished properly instead of merely stabilized. The copper cornice regreened and resealed rather than replaced, because the architect Mara hired, a careful woman who had grown up 2 towns over and remembered the Ambrose from childhood stories the way half the county did, insisted that some patina was worth more than any shine a new material could offer. The ground floor became what Aldous's letter had asked for without quite naming, a community space open to the town that had fed him, a reading room where the grand lobby's coffered ceiling had been, a set of low-cost meeting rooms for the kind of nonprofits and mutual aid groups that never could have afforded downtown rent otherwise, and, at Priadiyemi's suggestion, a small permanent exhibit built around the brass mailboxes and Ada Finch's photograph and 41 black notebooks displayed a page at a time behind glass, so that anyone who walked in off Canal Street could read, in a dead man's careful hand, exactly what it had cost to keep a promise for 71 years. The upper floors became apartments again, affordable ones, rented at rates set by the trust rather than the market, and the first tenant to move into a unit on the 6th floor, by her own request, and over Mara's gentle objection that surely she wanted something with better light, was a widow named Ruth Okonkwo's granddaughter, 81 years old herself now, who said only that her grandmother had told her stories about a building on Canal Street that fed people without ever asking to be thanked for it. And she had always wanted to see the inside of it before she died, and now, thanks to a stranger's kindness 80 years late, she was going to get to live in it instead. The investigation into the accelerated demolition order took the better part of a year to conclude, longer than any of them expected and shorter than Gerald Mott had privately feared, and it turned up exactly what a record's request into 6 months of correspondence tends to turn up when someone has been careless in the specific way desperate men are careless. 3 emails between a Prather Group project manager and the deputy in the city permitting office who had signed off on the fence timeline, and a 4th email, the one that mattered most, from Warwick Colby's own firm in Columbus, offering, in language just oblique enough that his lawyers would later argue for weeks over whether it constituted a bribe or merely an expression of gratitude, a consulting retainer to the permitting deputy's brother-in-law's engineering firm, timed within 9 days of the fence going up 9 hours early. The deputy resigned before the county could finish deciding whether to charge her. Dale Prather's company lost its standing contract with the city entirely, and, within the year, its name off the door of the building it had operated out of downtown, and Curtis Vance, whose photographs and testimony had done more to unravel the whole scheme than anyone else's, kept his landscaping business, expanded it, in fact. Once word got around Harlow Falls that he was the one who had told the truth when it cost him the most, and 2 summers later he was the man Mara hired to redo the courtyard behind the restored Ambrose Arms, an arrangement neither of them ever discussed as anything other than ordinary business, though both of them understood it as something closer to an apology accepted. Warwick Colby was never charged with anything at all, which Gerald Mott said did not surprise him in the least, since men who spend 3 generations building a legal position rarely leave enough of themselves exposed to be caught by anything short of their own conscience. And Colby, so far as anyone in Harlow Falls ever learned, did not appear to have much of one to catch him. He simply stopped coming to Ohio, and the button business his grandfather had once shared with Sylvan Ambrose passed, some years later, into a small item in a Columbus business paper's obituary section, noting his death and the modest, private nature of the service, no mention at all of gold or promises, or a town 3 hours south that had once nearly lost a piece of its own history to his family's very old, very patient grievance. On a Saturday in the following October, 13 months to the day after a coffee pot had never actually slipped from anyone's hands in this particular story, though Mara often thought, in the years after, that some version of that same tired morning existed for 100 women in 100 kitchens across the county on any given Tuesday. The Ambrose Arms opened its restored ground floor to the public for the first time in over 20 years. The whole town came, or close enough to it that Priya Adeyemi's follow-up article ran with a photograph that took up half the front page. The coffered ceiling gleaming with its chandelier, finally uncovered and cleaned and rehung. The hexagonal tile floor scrubbed back to its original black and white border of carved oak leaves, and beneath the wall of brass mailboxes, every door polished, every number legible. One door left standing open on purpose, 607, empty now of everything, except a single framed photograph of a young woman laughing at a switchboard and a small tin candy dish that someone, nobody would ever quite admit who, kept faithfully stocked with butterscotch wrapped in gold cellophane. Though the little girl who had first pocketed one without eating it was 9 years old now, and had long since outgrown the habit of saving things she loved too much to use up, or so she claimed, even as the dish stayed full. There was a scholarship fund too, smaller than the trust and older in Mara's own thinking than any of the lawyers realized, set up without any announcement in the spring before the building reopened, named for nobody, advertised nowhere, administered through the high school guidance office under nothing more specific than a line on an application asking whether a student worked outside of school hours to help support their family. Because Mara remembered exactly what it felt like to be a girl who could not afford the field trip and did not want to be remembered for that. And she had no interest in building a monument to her own generosity, only in making sure that somewhere in Harlow Falls, every single year, a kid who packed a lunch from the bottom of an empty jar got to go to the science museum anyway, without anyone at school ever needing to know why. Theo went to Ohio State 2 years later to study structural engineering, a choice nobody who had watched him with a chisel in a cold sub-basement found the least bit surprising, and Bertie, at 9, had already informed her mother with total confidence that she intended to run the reading room in the Ambrose lobby herself someday, because she had read every single book on its shelves twice already and thought somebody ought to be in charge of making sure nobody else's daughter ever had to wait. As long as she almost did to have a room full of stories that belonged, in some small permanent way, to her. Mara stood at the edge of the restored lobby that afternoon, in a dress she had bought for the occasion and still felt strange wearing, watching Bertie lead a cluster of other 9-year-olds on a tour of the mailbox wall with the flashlight Gerald Mott had given her years before, the same battered small flashlight, still working, its casing scratched from 4 years of being carried everywhere a person could carry a thing they loved, and watching Theo, 16 now, taller than his father had ever gotten to be, standing near the reading room doorway in quiet conversation with Delbert about the courtyard drainage, a boy who still noticed the one thing turned the wrong way in any room and had, over 4 years, turned that habit into something closer to a trade than a worry. Charlene found her near the coffee urn and squeezed her arm the way she had the morning she took the children without asking a single question, and said only, "Look at this place." And Mara did look at the chandelier, throwing soft gold light across a tile floor a boy of 14 had once swept every single day for 60 years without anyone in Harlow Falls ever once thanking him for it. And she thought, as she often did in quiet moments now, that gratitude arriving 80 years late was still gratitude, was maybe even truer for having waited, the way a debt paid slowly and completely means more than one settled in an easy afternoon. Earlier that same morning, before the doors opened to the public, before the caterer had even finished setting out the little sandwiches, Mara had driven out to Restwood Cemetery on the north edge of town with Theo and Bertie in the back seat, and a bundle wrapped in the same kind of oilcloth Aldous had once used to wrap a ledger, though what was inside it now was only a small brass key on a paper tag gone soft with handling. The master key to 607, the one Gerald Mott had worked off. His ring on their first morning inside the building. Aldous's grave sat plain and small under a maple that had only just begun to turn, a stone that read simply Aldous Finch, and the dates, and nothing else. No mention of 71 years or a fortune kept safe, or a town saved twice over by a boy who had once been told a secret he was too young to carry and had carried it anyway until his hands gave out. Theo knelt and set the key on the grass at the base of the stone, because Mara had asked him to, because some tasks felt like they belonged to the next generation rather than the one that had done the finding, and Bertie, 9 years old now and steadier in her own convictions than her mother had ever managed to be at that age, said only, "Thank you for waiting for us," in the plain, unadorned way children say the truest things. And then the three of them stood there a while longer in the cool October morning with nothing else needing to be said, because everything that could be said about a debt fully paid had already been carved, in a way, into a building 3 miles south of where they stood, and some gratitude, Mara had come to understand, was better spoken to a locked door and a quiet stone than to any crowd at all. Gerald Mott stayed at the graveside a moment longer than the rest of them, after Theo and Bertie had already turned back toward the car, and Mara, waiting by the open door, watched the old lawyer take off his hat the way he must have done at 100 other gravesides across 41 years spent, more often than not, outliving his clients without complaint, and say something too low for her to catch, 3 words at most, before he settled the hat back on his white hair and walked to the car. With the particular lightness of a man who has finally, after a very long time, finished the one piece of business he had never expected to close out in his own lifetime. Denise arrived late, flustered, apologizing for traffic that did not exist in a town this size, and found her way to Mara's side with a paper plate of the little sandwiches the caterer had set out, and stood beside her without saying anything for a long moment, which was, from Denise, its own kind of grace. Near 5, when the crowd had thinned and the low autumn light had gone the particular gold color that Mara had come to think of, privately, as the exact color of 607 at 4 in the afternoon, Gerald Mott found her by the front doors, 72 now, walking a little slower than he had that first Sunday morning with the thermos of coffee, and he held out an envelope, cream-colored, and for one strange lurching second her heart went back 3 years to a stairwell on Delmore Street, and a letter she had been afraid to open. "This one is easier," he said, before she could ask. "It is only a thank you. From the Dietz family. Warren and Alma's granddaughter. Actually, she lives in Dayton now. Teaches high school chemistry. She wanted you to know the check paid off her own daughter's college loans, which means, she said in her letter, that whatever her great-grandparents were owed in 1933 finally became somebody's education 92 years later, and she thought you would want to know that the debt did not just get paid. It got used for exactly the kind of thing it was always meant for." Mara read the letter standing in the doorway of a building that had once been condemned, holding an envelope from a woman she had never met whose family's whole shape had bent, however slightly, around a promise made by a man neither of them had ever known, and she thought of her own mother, whom she had lost too young the same way her grandmother had lost her mother young, and she thought of Danny at the kitchen table with the coffee going cold, and she thought, not for the first time, that the world did not owe anyone an $86 million apology for grief. That most people simply carried theirs the way Aldous had carried his silence, and Ada had carried hers, without complaint, checking the same door every single day for 60 years, because checking was the only kind of hope some people ever learned how to practice out loud. But once in a great while, rarely enough that it deserved to be marked when it happened, the world did pay something back, not because anyone had earned it exactly, but because somebody, a long time before, had decided that a debt worth keeping was worth keeping even after every person who created it was gone, and had built a floor over it, and waited, faithfully, for someone worth trusting to finally come and break it open. Mara folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket, the same coat. mended twice now instead of replaced, because some habits outlast the reasons a person first formed them. And she looked back once more into the lobby of the Ambrose Arms, gold light on old stone, her children's voices carrying across a room that had waited a century to hold this many happy people at once. And then she stepped out onto Canal Street, where the carved letters above the entrance still read Ambrose, and below them, smaller, worn nearly smooth by a century of rain, and finally, this year, gently resealed against another 100 of it, the two words that had once been a locked door and were now, simply, a fact about the building and the family who had kept it standing. Established 1926. And underneath that, in fresh lettering, the town had insisted on adding themselves, paid for by donation, not by trust money, a line Mara had not written and had cried the first time she saw it anyway, still keeping its promise. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.